Good morning. I'm Andy Kohut. I'm the president of the Pew Research Center, and thank you for joining us today as we review the findings of our study of the rise of Asian Americans. This is the latest in our effort to explore the changing face of America that has included studies of Muslim Americans, the millennial generation, and of course the ongoing surveys that we do of the Latino population. So it's natural in this context that we would look at in depth at Asian Americans, who the Census Department recently describes as the fastest growing racial group in the country. That may be the case, but when regular public opinion surveys are conducted, they are still too small a percentage of the sample to give us some sense of who they are. We don't know their values, their experiences, what they think about the issues of the day. We certainly can't tell you anything about different elements of the Asian American population from traditional Pew surveys. In fact, regular public opinion surveys tell us very, very little about the Asian American population, except maybe its approximate size or party affiliation, because we do that on an accumulated basis. So this year we set out to conduct a comprehensive attitude survey of Asian Americans and a very rigorous demographic analysis of this public. Today's report, however, is just the first in a series of surveys, reports that we will issue on this population. The next in line is one from our colleagues at the Forum on Religion and Public Life, which studies the religious beliefs, affiliations, and practices of the Asian American public. So let's get on with our conversation. Who are Asian Americans? What do they think about their lives, our nation, and the future? But again, before proceeding, a word of thanks to the Pew Charitable Trust, whose continuing support allows us to undertake this and much of the other research we do here on a nonpartisan and non-advocacy basis. My colleague, Paul Taylor, who led this research, will be our guide through today's conversation. Paul?
Thanks, Andy. Thanks to all of you for coming. Welcome to all of you. Just a quick rundown of what's going to happen this morning. We're going to start with a brief presentation, 10 or 12 minutes, of some key findings from this very comprehensive report, a PowerPoint presentation that my colleague Cary Funk will do. Then we will have two panels, and I hope they will unfold as conversations. I will moderate the panels. The first will be a panel of scholars and researchers. I'll introduce them when the panel begins, and the second will be a panel of leaders, both national leaders and Asian American community leaders, to discuss the implications of the findings that we're going to present this morning. Some housekeeping notes. As Andy said, this is the first of several reports that we will be issuing from this same survey. This survey was a joint project of some of the components of the Pew Research Center, the Social and Demographic Trends Project, and the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Together, the staffs of those two projects created the survey questionnaire. We had a lot of help from Asian American scholars. And there was another very deep report coming out in a few weeks looking at the religious profile of this group. A couple more quick housekeeping notes. If you go to pewresearch.org, you will find not only the full report, you will find, I think, a very attractive chart gallery that walks through some of the key findings, not only of all Asian Americans, but each of the 6 largest subgroups. And you can also go to an interactive map where you can click on every single county in the country, and you can find the current population of all Asian Americans in that county and each of the 6 largest subgroups. So there's a lot of information that we're delighted to be able to share. Let me also welcome our online audience to this event. We are webcasting the morning's events live, and we are also live tweeting this event. Our Twitter handle is pewresearch.org. If you would like to submit a question via Twitter using the event's hashtag, it is Asian Americans, all one word. At the end of each of the two panels, we'll open it up to some questions, both from the live audience here and perhaps from the Twitterverse. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague, Cary Funk, who is a senior researcher here and who led the questionnaire part of this survey. Very complicated, as she will describe, and then she will summarize briefly its findings.
Okay, good morning. As you've heard, Asian Americans have grown faster than any other race group since 2000 to 2010. And the number of newly arrived Asian American immigrants within the past decade or so has now surpassed the number of newly arrived Hispanic immigrants. So as of 2010, 36% of immigrants arriving are Asian American and 31% Hispanic. The total population of Asians in the U.S., as we mentioned, is roughly 17.3 million, according to the 2010 census. The Census Bureau has just released an estimate for 2011 numbers, putting the total at 18.2 million. The vast majority of Asian Americans can trace their roots to one of just six groups, countries of origin, as we'll call it here: Chinese, the Philippines, India, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. Together, Asians from these six groups make up at least 83% of all U.S. Asians. And the reason for that language, at least 83%, is because Asians, like any other race group, can be a single race or mixed race, and Asians can be of a single Asian group or from multiple Asian groups. So that makes it a little trickier to tally up without double counting people, but we know that it's at least 83% of all U.S. Asians. About 15% of U.S. Asians are mixed race and 2% are mixed Asian group. So as we mentioned, it's actually pretty rare to do a national survey of this kind with Asian Americans. Part of the reason for that is that although they may be the fastest growing race group, they still make up what in the survey research world we would call a rare population. About 5.5% of the adult population are Asian. That makes it complicated. So to reach people, it takes just a lot of effort, essentially. Just to give you an example of that, in this case, we talked with more than 65,000 households in order to identify households with an Asian American and complete interviews with about 3,500 Asian Americans. One of the other aspects that makes it challenging to do a survey of this kind is the diversity among Asian Americans. It's really a hallmark of Asian Americans, diversity in terms of history, culture, characteristics. So following the census, Asian Americans are grouped together as a race group, but we know from scholarly literature that has long drawn attention to important differences among Asian Americans. So we wanted a survey of this kind to be able to address the extent to which there are commonalities and differences among U.S. Asians. So to do that, we designed the survey with the idea that we really needed representative samples of subgroups of Asians. In this case, we have representative samples of the 6 largest U.S. Asian groups, each of which is constituting a very rare population from roughly 0.4% to 1.3% of adults in the U.S. population. So the project is akin to conducting 7 representative surveys simultaneously, once for all U.S. Asians and one each for the 6 largest U.S. Asian groups. In addition, as you know, in addition, doing a survey of this kind, it's important to include multiple languages. So in this case, we conducted interviews in English and in 7 Asian languages. The end result, I think, is extremely rich in what it can tell us. Obviously, we're only going to get a chance to see a small smattering here, but there's much more to come. So this report is based on a detailed analysis of census data as well as on the survey findings. Here's an example of what we know from the census analysis. And first, we see that one way Asian Americans stand out from other race groups in the U.S. is their high levels of education and income. About half of Asian Americans age 25 and up hold a bachelor's degree. That's more than is found for whites, blacks, or Hispanics. On the other side of the slide, similarly, Asian Americans have a higher median household income than do either whites, Hispanics, or blacks. Now, in terms of education levels, as in many other things, there's diversity among Asian Americans. Here you can see that Indian Americans are particularly high in education. About 7 in 10 U.S. Indians aged 25 and older have a bachelor's degree or more. And by contrast there on the bottom row, Vietnamese, about 26% of U.S. Vietnamese age 25 and older have a bachelor's degree. That's just below the U.S. population average. Now keep in mind that the high level of education attainment among Asian Americans is partly stemming from selective immigration. Here's an analysis showing that among recent immigrants, that is those arriving to the U.S. in the 3 years prior to the data collection from 2007 to 2010, 65% of Asian immigrants were either enrolled in college, enrolled in graduate school, or already had a college degree in hand, whether from a U.S. or another university. And that share is higher than for comparable immigrants who were white, black, or Hispanic. Second here. And as I mentioned, there's a good deal of diversity of outcomes among Asian Americans. Here's just one example. The poverty rate for all U.S. Asians is a little bit lower than that for the total adult population, but there's variation among these country of origin groups. Korean, Vietnamese, and Chinese Americans all have a poverty rate that is above the U.S. population average. Indian, Japanese, and Filipino Americans have a poverty rate below the U.S. population average. Now, one of the striking facts about Asian Americans is that 74% of adult Asian Americans are foreign-born. That's why we sometimes refer to Asian Americans as a whole as an immigrant group, but you also see some variation among U.S. Asian groups. Japanese Americans are majority U.S.-born, with 68% being born in the U.S., 32% foreign-born. The other largest U.S. Asian groups are majority foreign-born, with percentages ranging from 69% for Filipino Americans foreign-born to 87% among Indian Americans. And those differences tend to reflect different amounts of time that each group has been immigrating to the U.S. I'm going to turn here to some of the things we've learned from the survey, and this in particular is from a series of questions we ask about a number of different values they might hold in their personal lives, and you're asked to rate each one in terms of whether this is one of the most important things in your life, very important but not quite the most important thing, somewhat important or not too important. And what we're seeing here is that Asian Americans tend to be distinctive in terms of the emphasis they put on family, on marriage in particular, and on parenting, and as well on career success. So about 2/3 of Asian Americans say being a good parent is one of the most important things in their lives. That compares with about half of the general public saying the same. I think the next down here, about 54% of Asian Americans say that having a successful marriage is one of the most important things in life. By contrast, 34% of U.S. adults say this. And in both cases, actually, Indian Americans were particularly likely to say having a successful marriage and being a good parent was one of the most important things in their life, along with other groups who also rate those highly. And then more so than the general public, Asian Americans say success in a high-paying career is one of the most important things in their life. I move you too fast. Interestingly, I would mention that the living arrangements of Asian Americans tend to align with those values. So for example, we know that Asian Americans are more likely to be married than the general population. There are fewer Asian American newborns to unmarried women. That is, among women of childbearing age who gave birth in the past year, about 16% of Asian Americans were unmarried, compared with about 4 in 10 for the total population overall. And Asian Americans are more likely, therefore Asian American children are more likely to be raised in a household with 2 married parents relative to all U.S. children. The other aspect I think that is distinctive about Asian American values has to do with a belief in hard work. About 7 in 10 Asian Americans believe that people who want to get ahead can make it if they're willing to work hard. About 6 in 10 of the general public says that. And then this is 2 different questions, which is showing a perceptual gap when it comes to hard work. 57% of Asian Americans describe Americans more generally as very hardworking. That's the top bar here. But an overwhelming consensus at 93% considers their own country of origin group, either Korean American, Chinese American, so forth, to be very hardworking. And beliefs in hard work also transfer to beliefs about parenting, and here too is a perceptual gap. When Asian Americans evaluate American parents, a 62% majority say that American parents do not put enough pressure on their children to do well in school. In contrast, on a separate question here, the second bar, Asian Americans see parents from their own country of origin group quite differently. So just 9% say parents of their own country of origin group do not put enough pressure on children to do well. About half say parents from their country of origin group put the right amount of pressure on their children. Perceptions of discrimination against U.S. Asians because of their race tend to be less of a concern than we've seen in similar data for blacks or Hispanics over the years. This is a question showing that 13% of Asian Americans call discrimination a major problem, about half say it's a minor problem, and 35% say it's not a problem. And then when it comes to evaluations of how different groups get along here, overall, more than 8 in 10 Asian Americans say that their group gets along either very or pretty well with whites. A similar proportion say their group, meaning Filipino American, Indian American, and so forth, gets along either very or pretty well with other Asian groups. And about 7 in 10 say their group gets along with Hispanics either very or pretty well. About 6 in 10 say their group gets along with blacks about very or pretty well. Korean Americans' ratings of intergroup relations stood out on this measure. They were more negative about views of relations between Korean Americans and blacks in particular. Half of Korean Americans say their group gets along not too or not at all well with blacks. Now, as I mentioned, Asian Americans are grouped together as a single race in the U.S. Census, but that grouping is not necessarily how U.S. Asians see themselves. So in this case, we asked respondents if they most often describe themselves in terms of their country of origin group, such as Vietnamese or Vietnamese American, in terms of Asian or Asian American, or as an American. And here, a 62% majority say that the country of origin or that specific Asian group label is what they use most often. This is especially the case among Asian immigrants. 69% of the foreign-born Asians say that they use the country of origin label most often. That compares with 43% among US-born Asians who say this. And then interestingly, we see the same pattern among US Hispanics. 51% of Hispanics say they most often use their country of origin label, such as Mexican or Cuban, to describe themselves. 24% say they use the Latino or Hispanic label, and 21% say American. Now, as a majority immigrant group, I think it's particularly striking to see how positive Asian Americans are about the U.S. when asked to directly compare this country with the country that they, their parents, or their ancestors came from. 7 in 10 says the U.S. is better than their country of origin for the opportunity to get ahead. That's the top bar here. And the U.S. fares quite well in comparison to their country of origin on a range of other measures, including political and religious freedom, treatment of the poor, conditions for raising children. There's a little more divide over whether the U.S. or the respondent's country of origin has better moral values, close to the bottom there, at least less consensus. And then in one case, there's a different pattern here. A majority of Asian Americans say that their country of origin is better than the U.S. when it comes to the strength of family ties. Now, just under half of Asian Americans live in the western region of the U.S., a pattern that I think reflects historic immigration patterns. Half or more of each of these largest groups of Asians lives in the West. The exception is Indian Americans, who are more evenly dispersed across the 4 regions. And as we have mentioned, this is a really far-ranging report. It covers topics from political attitudes to transnational ties. We don't have time to do it justice here, but so I'm going to stop here so we can hear from our distinguished panelists. And I do not know how that goes.
Thank you. Why don't our first panel come on up and take your seats? I think there are little identifiers there, and I will very briefly introduce each of you. Longer bios are in your packet. We are delighted to be able to be joined this morning by Karthick Ramakrishnan, an associate professor of political science at UC Riverside. He's also a fellow here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He focuses in particular on civic participation, immigration policy, and the politics of race. We are also delighted to be joined by Tritia Toyota, an adjunct assistant professor at UCLA, with a joint appointment in the departments of Anthropology and Asian American Studies. Those of you from California will know Tritia Toyota as a leading broadcast journalist. She was an anchorwoman at, I think, 2 of the 3 major broadcast stations in LA, and a founder of one of the founders and past presidents of the Asian American Journalists Association. And then two of my colleagues here, two folks who, along with Cary and a cast of literally hundreds, had a lot to do with getting this great report out. Kim Parker, who is a senior researcher. She's the associate director of the Pew Social and Demographic Trends Project. And Devera Cohn, who's a senior writer here, a former demographics reporter at my alma mater, the Washington Post. As I say, I will moderate. We'll start the conversation and at some point bring all of you in. So Tritia and Karthick, let me start with each of you, and let me ask you to just react generally. It's a big, thick, 215-page report, but from your viewpoint as scholars who have been looking at this community, is there anything new? Is there anything that surprised you? Is there anything that's reaffirming or confirming what we have known? General reactions.
30 seconds.
As much time as you like.
Well, I think that, first of all, I think the Pew Report and the Research Center needs to be lauded for having done this, so Cary, congratulations on that. Clearly, there's a lot of information in this report, a snapshot, a survey snapshot of who Asian Americans are right now. I think that from the standpoint of public discourse, that this is a very valuable tool to use so that we can discuss who this particular American community is. I think that one of the big issues, and the Pew Report is pretty good about discussing this at length in various pages and various sections, is that there is tremendous heterogeneity in this community. There's tremendous complexity of experience, and that it is very difficult to capture this. While they are primarily focusing on the 6 major groups, it is essentially saying that maybe 17–18% of the Asian Pacific American population, which is what we are officially called by the census, is not really covered. 17–18% is a large percentage, and also that there are probably at least 24 Asian Pacific American groups in this country, and it is not just 6. Yes, these are the major groups, but it does not give a complete and clear picture of all of the Asian Pacific American groups. But having said that, I think that this is still a very valuable tool. It gives us a reason to have a conversation. It gives us a reason to really discover more about who the people are in this community, and hopefully to become more critical thinkers about the issues.
Well, thank you for having me here. And having done one of these surveys before, I know that even covering just the 6, there's so much diversity within, but even covering the 6, first of all, it goes well beyond what most surveys do, as Andy said, and as Cary had presented as well. So it's very commendable to prioritize research on Asian Americans, and it's great to see this report. I'd been in a previous meeting where Paul said that it would look like a phone book, and I thought he was kidding, but he was serious. Especially since they don't do phone books anymore, maybe some people need a reference on what that is. In terms of what I think, a couple of things that I think are very important. One of them is building an additional data point to some of the census data that has been coming out, which is a complex picture of what immigration is in the US. We know this to be true over the past few decades, but it is especially true today. And you still have a dominant image either in media portrayals or even in public opinion. I've done research on public opinion in which we do these survey experiments where we ask people their reactions on immigration or immigrants, and we compare it to their reactions of different groups. And we see no difference between when people are asked about immigrants and when they're asked about Mexican immigrants and when they're asked about illegal immigrants. Right? So the dominant image people have in their minds is a particular slice of the immigration story. So one of the important things in this report is to see that immigration is more complicated than that. And in the past 5 years, if you were not paying attention to Asian immigration, you don't know about immigration. So that's something that I think is an important message. The other thing I was going to say, if I have just a few more seconds here, is it's important to know that this is a moving target. So some of the findings here in terms of the Pan-Asian label, if you look at the differences by nativity, you see changes happening on many of these dimensions. So as the community stays longer in the US, when you're talking about the first generation population, Or if you go from the first generation to higher generations, and there have been some prior studies where we've had access to the microdata to be able to analyze this, you see that whether or not this is one group or many changes over time, and it'll continue to do so. So this is just to say that if either Pew or other organizations can continue to prioritize studying Asian Americans in the future, this is for now the definitive word, but we need to have more efforts like these in the future.
Well, let me pick up on that and return to Tricia's opening comments where you stressed the heterogeneity of this population. The host culture, the United States, has been classifying people by race since the beginning. Sure. And Asians are the latest group to be classified by race. As we've discussed, there are many differences within that classification. Does the Pan-Asian racial classification illuminate or does it obscure, or does it do both? And from the perspective of people who are part of the community, who have studied the community, is the label welcome? Is it considered irrelevant? What's your sense of how people think of themselves racially?
Well, to begin with, I think what the survey found out is probably true, that, and of course we all know that identity is situational in any case, so it depends, I guess, on who you're talking to, who asked you the question, what are you, who are you. I think that in terms of scholarly research, we understand that Asian Pacific American, if you will, is sort of the standard, the rubric by which racial groups and ethnic groups in the United States are classified. Disaggregation is extremely important when you're talking about any kind of ethnic or racial community, so that you get a fuller picture of what's happening. When we talk about education, when we talk about racial discrimination, such as the Pew survey did, yes, it's important to have an overall picture, but what do specific groups say, and in particular with Asian Americans, right? Because it is an immigrant community. Yeah, we've been here for 150 years plus, clearly. But what we're really talking about, and what the survey found out, is essentially still an new immigrant community. And I agree with Karthick that if you hadn't been paying attention in the last 4 or 5 years, for a lot of people this may come as a big surprise. But in terms of the Asian American, Asian Pacific American thing, I think it's cumbersome. I think we recognize it as scholars, but we also recognize the need for not necessarily homogeneity, right, but heterogeneity. And also, if you're talking about Asian Pacific American, yes, the rise of Asian Americans is the headline, the best educated, the highest income, or et cetera, but exceptionality does not make for typicality in any kind of a study, so that's what we have to keep in mind.
So on the thing I wanted to add on the Asian American label is this is complicated stuff, and the reason why I'll say it's complicated is that if you think about race and ethnicity, sometimes people think of those as one and the same. So you have Latinos, for instance, who do not believe that Hispanic is an ethnicity. They think of it as a race, and they bedevil the U.S. Census by putting Hispanic as one of the racial categories. So I think this will be an important part of the conversation moving forward. One of the other kind of data points I think that could help on this, and this surprised me, is we had a question in 2008 in a survey that we did, in which we said, what, if anything, do Asians share in common? Do they share a common race? Do they share a common culture? Do they share common economic interests? And do they share common political interests? Now, the highest proportion were people saying that Asians share a common culture. Now, that would be surprising to most people who think, okay, so you have different religions in here, different languages. How can these people think that they have a common culture? But it all depends on how they interpret culture to mean. So I think some of these things, I think it's worth in the future playing around with some of these questions. Now, of course, this will mean more resources to do this, but I think the way people think about race and the way they experience race requires different types of questions that can be brought to bear. And I think especially when if you think of race as a marker of disadvantage, for instance, certainly some groups, and you have this in the report here, especially Southeast Asian, largely refugee populations, have experience a fair amount of disadvantage in terms of poverty, lack of health insurance, problems finding housing. So it is important to look beyond that racial or pan-Asian label for a host of reasons.
One more question on this subject. You mentioned Hispanics, and they have this similar challenge of how comfortable they are in different situations with a pan-Hispanic label. What Hispanics do have, however, even though, like Asians, they come from more than 20 different countries, is they have a common language. Asians do not have a common language. Moreover, Asians from those large ascending countries have centuries, if not millennia, of history of rivalry, conquest, and all the rest. It's a pretty rich history. In your experience in this country, does that play out? We had a finding there that more or less Asians say they get along pretty well with other Asian groups. So is there sort of a bond or a kinship that may be stronger here than it might be back in Asia?
Right. I mean, I think this is part of when you go beyond the first generation. And it's important to note this because Latinos, in addition to having the common language, they are more likely to be native-born than foreign-born. And this is another important thing that most people don't realize, is that among the racial groups, Asian Americans are the most heavily immigrant, right? So this question about how people might feel about others from other countries of origin, I would say even for me, speaking personally, I myself moved to the US when I was 12 years old and went to college here. Even having different people from different parts of India relating to each other, a lot of that happens in the United States, although it's starting to happen more in India now. But certainly you have a lot of friendships that go across country of origin lines in college and beyond. So among the second generation, mostly because a lot of them don't speak their native language as well as the first generation, these kind of country of origin differences don't matter as much as they do among the foreign-born.
One of the striking findings from our demographic research was the high levels of education of arriving immigrants. And we posted the numbers up there. And actually, I was struck by a quote in this morning's Washington Post that did a little article on the story, quoted a local leader of the Virginia Asian Chamber of Commerce, My Lai Tran, who said of the very high level of educational achievement. It's always been that way for 6,000 or 7,000 years. Now that's a pretty impressive number. In fact, we're able to look back 30 years and ascertain that the educational credentials of the Asian immigrants who are arriving right now, you have roughly 6 in 10 either already having their college degree or recently received it here. It's about double the share of double the share of all other immigrants right now, and double the share of Asian immigrants 30 years ago. So in other words, just within the last 30 years, since we've begun to open up immigration stream to much of the world, very much including Asia, taking advantage of H-1B programs, taking advantage of colleges and universities that are reaching out to students, and particularly Asians, we see a very different educational profile. Is that, in your experience, is that mostly changes in policies here? Is it mostly changes in dynamics in the leading sending countries? Both of you are in a campus setting. What's your sense of that?
Well, I think it's probably both. I think there are two points that need to be made about educational levels. I really think it is also a function, particularly post-1965, with changes in immigration law here, that these are specific professions, specific categories in which the United States is very interested in having people come. There is specific recruitment, professional recruitment, and so that you have a group of educated individuals who are being asked, come to the United States, as you mentioned, H-1B visa is just one, so that they are being targeted for also being very highly educated. Now, I certainly think in the last 30 years there have been a lot of changes in specific Asian countries with regard to education, that it has, because of global influences or whatever you want to talk about, has improved. But I think that there are still some difficulties in saying, yes, I come to this country with a bachelor's degree from X country. I think it's difficult to do a comparable study on pedagogical differences in Asia, whether or not a 4-year college is comparable in Asia to the United States, or a 2-year college, et cetera. So having a 4-year university education is a survey question that you can ask, but to get at a deeper meaning, not only of what the education consists of, but also, and we'll get into this I'm sure in a bit, does that education translate into professional jobs, income, et cetera? So I think there are a couple of things that need to be sort of unpacked a little bit further when we talk about that.
Karthick?
Yeah, on the selectivity question, I did a little bit of research last night because I kind of sensed that this would be true, and I had to try to find some statistics on higher educational attainment in some of these Asian countries, because it is a very selective group. So when you talk about 2/3 of people among the recent immigrants coming in that have a bachelor's degree, if you look at India and China, a source of many of these BAs, it's about 6 to 7% of their local population that have tertiary higher education. So that's important to note, that I think it's important to note because when we're trying to make assessments and analyses of this population, we're talking about a very select group, right? So before we run and think so this comment about, of course, for 6,000 years we've been doing education, well, their bachelor's attainment rates are lower than in the United States, for instance, right? So it's important to kind of keep that perspective in mind in terms of who are the immigrants coming in. They're a very select group from their countries. Another important issue is among people coming in with BAs, and it's not those that are coming in on professional visas. As we know, most of the people who come in as legal permanent residents come under family sponsorship. So you have Asian immigrants that have their bachelor's degrees that are related to their sponsors here, but they do have more difficulty integrating into the job market because they are not sponsored by an employer. Some of their credentials in foreign countries are not given as much weight because they don't know what to make of a degree coming from some of these Asian countries as opposed to the various universities.
So let me ask you this. What are the push factors? This is a big topic, but let me at least get your first reaction to it. We know that the major sending countries are the rising economic powers of the 21st century, China, India, Korea, and others. That's where the biggest wave has been coming from Asia in the last decade or so. So it raises the question. Presumably, these are economies roaring along at 6, 8, 10% GDP growth every year. What is drawing them to this country? The best and the brightest, as you describe it, or among the best and the brightest.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is a little bit counterintuitive, right? Because in the 60s and 70s, there were all these complaints about brain drain from these countries. There weren't enough opportunities in these countries, and they were coming to the United States. Now it seems that there's less of an issue there because these are very dynamic economies, and there are even people who are getting educated in the U.S. looking for jobs in India and China. But that said, you do have improvements in educational attainment in these countries. So the 6 to 7% figure that I quoted, that's been up from 4 to 5% 20 years ago in these countries. And given just the sheer size of some of these Asian countries, you just have a lot more people in the pool, in the labor pool, as it were. You also have family sponsorship as being important. So people are still attracted to come to this country. So that's one of the reports one of the findings you have deep into this report is how people compare opportunities in the U.S. or life in the United States to their countries of origin. And even though we're in a downturn now, people still see the United States as a far better place to be than their home countries on various measures. And so I think that's part of it.
Let me ask a couple of questions about group relations, and one is, as we report in the arguably the most intimate realm of group relations, intermarriage or marriage across racial lines. And I don't think we showed that slide, but we've done several reports on this. Asians are more likely than any other race group to marry outside their race, and if you look at recent marriages, about 29% of all recent marriages are between of Asians involved and non-Asian as either the bride or the groom. What does that say? It gets back to the identity question. What does that say about a sense of social integration? What does that say about the children of those marriages? Are we getting to a place where the racial differences, the cultural differences do start to melt away? How is that perceived among folks you know?
I would like to think so, that it becomes a great social leveler. I think that clearly for the Asian Pacific American community that the children of unions, the mixed race population, is really going to change the demographic of the communities in the next several years. I see it in my own classes, much higher numbers of mixed race children. And though they are mixed race, I think what is really interesting is that by and large, they are very interested in the, if you will, the Asian Pacific part of their heritage, though they may be part black or part Latino or part white, that they really want to find out about both sides of their heritage and that they really value that. So I think in terms of, as you say, intergroup relations, yes, at some point, you know, if we all sort of become medium brown colors, right, that perhaps will mitigate some of the problems that we've had in the past. I'm not going to say they're going to go away completely, because I think that your study also shows that, yeah, racial discrimination among Asian Americans is perceived as not much of a problem, but I sort of want to put another spin on your statistics. I think were saying about 35% think it's not a problem, something like that, and you can correct me. But turned around the other way, that means that there's 60-something% of those people who were polled, 60% plus, who think that is some kind of a problem still. And I think that also echoes other surveys that have been done about racial discrimination. So clearly for Asian Americans, and there are some other statistics that you also found out about how they perceive themselves culturally, how they feel that they are being integrated, housing segregation, for example, apparently still continuing. So we have a ways to go in terms of intergroup relations, but clearly intermarriage is one way to sort of mitigate that.
Kim, could you just jump in? We do have more findings on perceptions of discrimination and experiences with discrimination, and some ability to compare responses to those questions with responses of other minority groups.
Right. Unfortunately, we don't have exact comparisons, you know, slightly different question wording across the surveys, but in other Pew Research Center surveys, we found that about 43% of blacks said that there was a lot of discrimination against blacks, which again is a little bit different from what we asked in the Asian American survey, is discrimination against your country of origin group a major problem. But in our survey, we found only 13% saying that discrimination against their country of origin group is a major problem. And we also have a more comparable question that we asked in one of our Pew Hispanic surveys. Is discrimination a major problem in Hispanics succeeding in this country? And 61% of Hispanics said that it was a major problem. So that sets up a pretty sharp contrast between the perceptions Hispanics have about the discrimination that they experience versus the perceptions that Asian Americans have.
And we also had a question in terms of getting a job, getting into college. Does being an Asian American help you, hurt you, or make no difference?
Yeah, and we had about 60% for each of those, getting into college, getting a job, or getting a job promotion. About 60% for each of those questions said it really doesn't make much of a difference.
Could I just say, add something on this? I mean, I think this is where to talk about some of those smaller groups, I think would be important, and given the cost and the difficulty, even of doing 7 simultaneous surveys, the way that Cary mentioned. So if you look at some of the Southeast Asian refugee populations, we don't have surveys in terms of their discrimination, but we know about their poverty rates. We know about problems in terms of educational attainment. So I think these are areas for future study to, because in this larger context, you have a general story that might mask some of the problems within, especially for groups that we were not able to survey.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
I mean, I totally agree with what Karthick is saying, and also what the survey found. There have been a few surveys done with regard to some of the Southeast Asian students, and dropout rates are extremely high in high school, approaching 45 to 50% of some of those populations. So yes, there are some Asian groups who are extremely successful, but again, I think disaggregation of data is very important to get at some of the underrepresented communities within the population, but also not just to look at entry into college, right, but to look at retention, to look at years it takes to graduate, not very many people graduate in 4 years anymore from a university. And that looking more closely at that data, I think, will present a clearer picture of what educational and social policy ought to be with regard to some of the underrepresented groups.
I'm going to have one more question, and then we'd like to open it up, and I think we have some roving mics. My last question is another aspect of group relations, and we're reminded this weekend the passing of Rodney King. That was 20 years ago this spring that the LA riots broke out, and one thread of those riots, one aspect of those riots, were property damage and deaths within the Korean community, giving a history of tension between Korean shopkeepers and black customers in black neighborhoods. You two both have Southern California roots. I'd be curious to get your perspective on that 20 years later. You may or may not know, Karthick, I think, has been here in D.C. This issue has arisen here in D.C. in the last few months. Our former mayor and current city council member has gone after Asian shopkeepers in black neighborhoods, and it seems to be a source of tension and a kind of an open sore. What's your sense? And as we said, Koreans in particular, among all the Asian country of origin subgroups, register a feeling that relations between blacks and Koreans are not doing well.
Yeah, one thing I was going to say is it illustrates to me the importance of political leadership, and especially if you do that DC to LA comparison. In the last 20 years in Los Angeles, you've had a lot of community organizations, but even political leadership within the city, knowing the kind of diversity within the city, trying as much as possible to mitigate that. So things in Los Angeles are not great by any stretch of the imagination, but they're much better in terms of inter-community dialogue than before. And you have the one thing that's important to note with these problems is that a lot of Asian immigrants, especially those that are shopkeepers, find themselves in these kind of middleman minority roles, in which they go and open businesses in neighborhoods where there isn't that much capital or investment to begin with, so they rely on their private networks to raise that capital. But they are seen by other members of the community as foreign. And this is something that Claire Kim, a political scientist, has showed very well, is that despite all of these impressive educational and income statistics, even in their second and third generation, Asian Americans are still perceived as foreign. And that's something, when you're talking about acceptance into a society, that is something that's still, that is a barrier that still needs to be overcome. I know so many friends who are part of third and fourth generation Asian Americans that still get derogatory remarks yelled at them when they're crossing the street.
Yeah. 20 years seems like a long time, but in fact it really isn't. I would agree with Karthick that there have been improvements in Los Angeles, but we have a long ways to go yet. And just as an aside, today is, for example, the 30th anniversary of the death of Vincent Chin in Detroit. And that was a watershed event for Asian Americans in terms of political empowerment, people who were able to get together to demand justice, even though it wasn't what was expected. And I think the Asian American community, one of the things that really stands out for me in this particular study is that there is a high degree of community and civic engagement on the part of Asian Americans, irrespective of electoral politics. But the willingness to get involved, the willingness to be participatory. And I think that these kinds of events, the unrest, events like Vincent Chin, galvanize people, that they begin to see, particularly the immigrant population who then become naturalized, they begin to see that this is the conversation, this is the kind of participation that American democracy demands and allows and permits. And I think that that was one of the wonderful things about the study, is that it appears that civic engagement is growing.
Questions from our audience? We have some folks with mics. If you just want to raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. If you would just identify yourself briefly.
Good morning. I'm with Lisa Hasegawa with the National Coalition for Asian Pacific Americans and also with the National Council for Asian Pacific Americans. Good to see you all. I appreciate, Karthick and Tricia, your comments and attempts to try to put some nuance to some of the things in the report. And so I think that, there have been a bunch of emails going around this morning from the executive directors of the National Asian American and Pacific Islander groups, and there is concern about the impact of the report on the perception, the public perception of Asian Americans as, again, monolithic. And so I think that I just wanted to point out just one particular piece that we are working on at that national capacity. Looking at the same census data, again, it's the flip side of the coin. You talked about the increase in highly educated Asian immigrants. And so I think that some of the things a lot of the advocacy groups are working on are related to the issues of poverty in a lot of the Southeast Asian communities that Karthick referenced, and Pacific Islanders as well. And so we found that there was a 46% increase in the growth of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in poverty, so that now today there's about 1.7 million Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who are living in poverty. And so that increase is compared to a 24% increase for African Americans and 26% for non-Hispanic white populations. And similarly with the Latino community, there's been a 55% increase in the level of poverty. So I guess I'm just wondering, what are you guys considering doing in terms of getting to some of those nuances, which I think are also very important trends in terms of the public's perception about the community. And also, we would love to be more involved with you all in the analysis.
We made an effort to draw as complete a portrait as we could from the available economic and demographic data. We did point out there are some negative statistics. Do you want to walk through some of them in terms of the poverty and also increase in long-term unemployment and increase relative employment levels relative to educational attainment?
Well, certainly as a general statement, if people will look under the hood of this report and examine the figures that we published for the 6 largest groups, you'll certainly see much variation and diversity there on some of the key measures. For example, and Cary went through some of them on poverty. There are some groups that are above the national level for poverty. Some subgroups, Koreans, Vietnamese, Chinese Americans, and some groups that are below, Indian Americans, Japanese, Filipinos. Similarly with income, there's much variation. There's some groups that are just about at the national level for median household income and others that are above it. And we also looked at unemployment statistics. There was a report that some of you may have seen from the Economic Policy Institute about long-term unemployment being an issue among Asian Americans. We found some variation, some issues, especially with the more educated component of the Asian American community and unemployment levels. So certainly, although the overall message is that that the community overall has some high achievement levels, if you look carefully at the numbers we provide, I think they also offer a more nuanced picture of variation and diversity.
And the other group, which is anywhere from 15 to 17%, and it's from a dozen or 20 different countries. We were a little reluctant to lump them together because we wanted to respect the fact that there are differences within them. But nonetheless, when you aggregate the other group, you find a profile that is a little bit less successful on the classic socioeconomic indicators.
Yes, we do present some of that data for the other as a whole, but it wouldn't have been fair to assume that all of the subgroups, the Hmong, the Bhutanese, whoever, among these 20 or more subgroups are exactly equal to the other population. And if I could add one more thing, just because there have been references here to the Pacific Islanders, our report is strictly focused on Asian race, which is the census category that, as many of you know, Pacific Islanders were formally included with Asian race groups in census counts, but starting in 2000, they've been separated out. And so we just looked at Asian Americans overall.
Other questions?
Thank you. I'm Susan L. Allen. I'm the National President of the U.S. Pan Asian American Chamber of Commerce Foundation. We're 27 years old this year. In 2007, we conducted a nationwide study on the most unemployed or underemployed Asian American groups in the country. And that is the Chinatown Chinese, the Cambodians, Laotians, and I used to call when I was in Hong Kong, the Indo-Chinese immigrants. Right now we are conducting a 2.5-year study on the 6 largest ethnic groups, such as what you have just done, the Chinese, the Indians, the Koreans, the Filipino, Vietnamese, and Japanese Americans, on the business practices. So I understand how difficult it is to try to cover the whole panoply of 43 subgroups, because it is impossible, and it is time-consuming and very expensive, and you come up with little data. My question is, and I briefly looked at the report, and to what we are talking about today, job creation and business, small business, I am surprised to not see anything on the contribution of Asian Americans in business. And on that point, I want to bring a higher note today. Asian American is the fastest growing in business formation, produce the most jobs among the minority business community. We're 1/3 of all the minority business community combined, that is Blacks, Hispanic, Asian, and Native Americans. We produce about 50% or more of the gross receipts and the jobs. With the global economy, with China and India being two of the BRIC countries, I'm just wondering why this component had not been included in it. Thank you.
We did what we could, and I believe we have a little bit on occupation and on self-employment, but we did not. At the end of the day, this was less an effort to describe. This was an effort to illuminate the key characteristics of the human population, and obviously including their economic circumstances. The analysis you are suggesting, and it's perfectly valid, it would be more framed around what contribution this group is making to the overall economy. That was, in effect, not our research question, if you will. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say that it's good. I mean, I think it's important to have different groups that are have their different research priorities, because the thing about this report is that I think it's an important conversation starter. And there are a lot of, one thing I would encourage the journalists either in the room or watching or listening remotely is to dig in to this report. Don't just have this as a one-day story. Take it as bedtime reading if you want, because there is a lot of things there. And also on top of that, what this report is really good at is it presents facts. But in terms of analyzing the dynamics that produce those facts, this is when you need to talk to social scientists and community organizations and other people, right? Because it's a conversation starter. And we need to broaden this conversation, and I'm thrilled that Pew has done this.
Listen, that's a good moment. Thank you very much, Karthick and Tritia and my colleagues. This is a moment for us to transition to the next panel. We will transition very quickly. I would say this panel will be reassembled within 3 or 4 or 5 minutes. If you have some need to rush out, please do so, but back in your seats within just a few minutes, and we'll go at this one more time with another group of panelists. But thank you very much for joining us.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.